Morning, Mr. Secretary.
Representative.
Thanks for coming this morning.
Thank you.
I think if people in Greece actually had access to PCN this morning, I think they would be laughing, because twice today they've heard the word austerity, and I think that country knows a little bit about austerity. This budget that we're currently in was just described as being austerity measures were taken, except for the fact that we spend 25% higher than the national average in K through 12 on a per pupil basis, in spite of the fact that this budget spends more than any other state budget on basic education. They also heard the word austerity used to describe the governor's budget proposal, which increases spending by 16%, raises $4 billion. Those don't sound like austere budgets to me. But with that said, I guess we will take the Secretary at his word that there is actually more that the governor would like to spend. We just can't afford to spend. Mr. Secretary, I'm really curious as to how the governor in February of last year said a 5% severance tax would bring in $550 million. May of last year, a 5% severance tax would bring in $700 million. September of last year, a 5% severance tax would bring in $1 billion. And then in this budget proposal, the governor said a 5% severance tax is projected to generate more than $1 billion in annual revenue. The problem is, over the course of those 12 months, the price of natural gas has fallen by at least 50%. So while his revenue numbers are skyrocketing, the price of gas is plummeting. And nowhere over those 12 months did the governor say a 5% tax plus this 4.8 cent rider, as some folks have called it. Never did he mention a 4.7 cent volume tax on top of the 5%, which actually doesn't make it 5% anymore. It makes it 5% plus. And then, shortly after getting the keys to the office, we find out not only is it 5% plus, but we're going to ignore the market realities, and we're just going to put an arbitrary floor in place. Whatever the price of gas is selling in the market, Harrisburg doesn't care. We're just going to say that you should pay a tax on $2.97. And the whole time we've heard this thing, Mr. Secretary, about competitiveness. Every other state. In fact, it says in your budget book, this approach has the benefit of being field tested. Is the $2.97 floor ever been field tested in those other natural gas producing states that you mentioned?
It's field tested in the liquid fuels tax that we just put in place in Act 89 2 years ago.
Could you just please answer the question that was asked? I mean, in fairness, has it ever, you've said that every natural gas producing state in the country has a severance tax. Does any of those severance taxes that you keep talking about and the administration keep talking about have an arbitrary floor in place?
Again, in our own liquid fuels tax that we put in place 2 years ago, yes, there's a floor.
Mr. Secretary, could you just please answer the question, does any of the severance taxes in the nation have an arbitrary floor in place? I don't care if there's an arbitrary floor in some tax, in the severance tax.
Again, yes, our liquid fuels tax.
So our severance tax has it, is that what you're saying? So our severance tax has an arbitrary floor.
The severance tax, the language that we provided to the General Assembly included the recommendation that we include a floor.
I'm familiar. Yes, sir. That's what I was referencing.
I will say, if you're asking, that's a conversation we're happy to have with the General Assembly. If the General Assembly thinks that's inappropriate, we're happy to have that dialogue. So we thought that was important to guarantee some stability in the tax revenue received, consistent with the way we structured our liquid fuels tax that we put in place 2 years ago.
I don't disagree, Mr. Secretary, that there's predictability in what is a very difficult arena to predict a price, because the price does fluctuate. But that doesn't mean that we can then say that the governor's plan is field tested in West Virginia if it's not the same standard or the same test that they put in place in West Virginia, Texas, Oklahoma. And I've heard the administration say all the states that have a severance tax, but you can't say this has been field tested if it hasn't been field tested.
Well, again, to your point, in West Virginia, while we have modeled the proposed tax to the tax that West Virginia uses, there are important differences. I'll note two of them. West Virginia does impose additional local taxes that we wouldn't impose, so the tax in place in West Virginia is actually on a comparative basis higher. What West Virginia does for the purposes of
Mr. Secretary,
determining...
I didn't ask about the whole West Virginia portfolio. I have other questions I'd like to ask.
But you ask about a comparison with West Virginia.
No, I asked if they had a floor, and you answered that.
Well, no, but the answer for West Virginia, you need to understand. Their price component is determined voluntarily. We think that that's not the right model. We wouldn't do that here. As I said earlier, if the General Assembly deems it inappropriate to have a floor, that's a conversation that we're happy to have.
I appreciate that. I'll go back to the question I was going to ask. The 4.8 cents, I believe it's 4.7 cents volume tax. How many states in the country that have a severance tax have a 5% or a 4% tax plus a volume tax on top of that, 4.7%?
I'm not going to pretend to know or be completely knowledgeable about how all states that have severance taxes in place apply those taxes. I can tell you in comparison to our two closest neighbors, I've already talked about West Virginia. The tax plan that we recommend would be lower than the tax plan being recommended in Ohio.
I think the General Assembly has rejected the governor's proposal in Ohio. I think that they have a severance tax of about 1% in Ohio, regardless of what the governor has proposed. But I think you alluded to that one state in the country, West Virginia, has a 5% severance tax plus this volume tax of 4.7%. What you didn't mention, and the governor's been kind of missing, is that that is set to expire in West Virginia. So while we are making the administration is making this argument that this is just like West Virginia, are you proposing that 4.7 cents expire when West Virginia's expires as well?
We are proposing that an appropriate and competitive severance tax should be put in place. We are proposing that the bulk of those resources be used to invest in our public education system, and we think there is broad public support throughout the Commonwealth to support the tax plan that we've recommended.
I wish I could just get a one-word answer, because I hear what you're saying, that this is about education funding, but we've heard multiple times that the money is being used for alternative energy, and the governor keeps talking about it needs to be used for education. You just said it again, but the money is not just being used for education. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.